Hello and welcome to the Brief Podcast, where we try to bring you context, analysis, and perspective of current events and international affairs and put them into a little sharper focus. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. Be sure to give us a like and follow us if you enjoy what you find here. We're on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Iran and Israel traded attacks and counterattacks that put the Middle East on edge amid fears this war in Gaza would lead to wider conflict. Iran has played a central role in the current conflict as a supporter of Hamas, to be sure, though it denies any advance knowledge of the October 7th attacks. This is a war that's dragged on now for more than 6 months, leaving more than 1,200 Israelis dead, more than 120 others still held hostage in Gaza, and killing more than 30,000 Palestinians, most of them civilians, most of them women and children. What does Iran want? Why is its role risking destabilization in so many places? And how is the U.S. positioned to continue supporting Israel's military action in Gaza just as risky for the region? Our guests can talk about that. Trita Parsi is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's also the founder and former president of the National Iranian-American Council. He talks with virtually all sides that are involved in or are directly affected by the tragedy that is Gaza today. Trita Parsi, hello and welcome to The Brief. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, when we look at this, it could have been a lot worse, this exchange between Israel and Iran. At the same time, we're told neither one of them want a wider conflict. Neither one of them, want to go directly to war with one another. And yet they brought us right to the edge in this case.
It certainly could have been much worse. I think the entire world drew a bit of a sigh of relief when the Iranians started to downplay this whole thing, probably dramatically exaggerate and say that there's been no damage at all. They even say that there were no ballistic missiles, which contradicts what the U.S. Government officials have said. But if that's the way for them to essentially find a face-saving way out and break this escalatory cycle, then I think everyone will be quite happy about that. I don't know, however, Jim, if it's entirely accurate to say that neither one of them wants a war. I mean, the Biden administration has been very concerned from the very beginning of this latest conflict since October 7th, that Israel has had an interest and a desire to expand the war at least into Lebanon and to get rid of Lebanon from its borders. And knowing quite well that that very likely would have led to a confrontation with Iran. Now, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing the U.S. to go to war with Iran for more than 20 years. So you have that backdrop as well. And on top of that, I think we should not forget, Netanyahu knows quite well that his political career ends the minute this war ends. And his political sentence probably begins shortly thereafter. So he doesn't have the same interest as Biden does in terms of de-escalation, not enlarging the war, etc. And that is part of the reason I think it's, the manner in which the Biden administration has designed its policy is very much moving in tandem with Netanyahu, even though Netanyahu does not appear to have the same objectives.
There are so many moving parts here. And let's talk about Lebanon and Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, on one hand, did not really, in a full-throated way, join in that massive missile and drone assault on Israel. But in recent days, they have also gone in and used their tactics, if you will, to penetrate Israel's own anti-missile defense system and strike at targets causing casualties. They have demonstrated that higher level of sophistication and expertise.
Certainly. And I think what you have seen ever since October 7th is that there has been a steady escalation between Israel and Hezbollah, but short of all-out war. More than 200 Hezbollah fighters have been killed by Israel. And the bombings in southern Lebanon have been quite extensive. And the Hezbollah has, of course, targeted Israel as well. So you've seen an increase on that front. Certainly has not decreased, mindful of what happened between Iran and Israel. But short of an all-out war, and I think both sides there are under various forms of pressures not to allow this to escalate much further. But what we are seeing, both in what happened in 2006, but particularly since 2006, the last time Hezbollah and Israel went to war with each other, is that the technological playing field has evened tremendously. In 2006, when Hezbollah essentially beat Israel in that short 34-day war, there were no big role for drones in that war. Today, this war is going to be all about drones and technologies of that kind that simply were not around in this manner back then. And that is something that has leveled the playing field between Israel, Iran, Israel, Hezbollah. So the superiority Israel militarily enjoyed 20 years ago is not what it used to be. It's still clearly the most powerful country in the region, but not with the same preponderance of superiority as it had before.
But when we look at, and I was there in 2006 and saw that war unfold, there was a loser. I mean, I don't know if Hezbollah won or Israel won, but I know the loser, and it was Lebanon. Their infrastructure was just devastated, much like Gaza has been devastated, obviously not as bad as what we see in Gaza, but there's been a reluctance on the part of Hezbollah to go too far, to cause too much provocation, just because they know that the Israelis, maybe they're outmatched when it comes to, or they're evenly matched when it comes to drones and ballistic missiles, but at the same time, they can unload a huge amount of bombs and other attacks on the civilian infrastructure.
Absolutely. And that you're absolutely right. That's exactly what happened last time. The Lebanese infrastructure was absolutely devastated. And this time around, if the Israelis were to do it, it would likely go much faster and harder from the outset. So what has not changed is Israel's ability to devastate other countries in the region. That is the same as it was before. What has changed is that other countries or militias, their ability to, at the same time, inflict significant damage onto Israel. That is now new. This does not exist in the same manner back in 2006. And the attack by the Iranians, which has largely been deemed as a failure, although I personally don't think that it necessarily was. The Israelis shot down about 87% of the projectiles with the help of the US, France, and the UK.
They say 99%.
Well, they've taken it down to 87% at this point. But bottom line, though, is that what happened in this episode is that with the Iranians giving the Israelis about 72 hours of a heads up, which then enabled the United States to quickly get involved and help Israel together with France and the UK, it led to a scenario in which most of these projectiles were shot down, and they were of second rate. This is not the best stuff that the Iranians have. But even with that, they managed to get 7 ballistic missiles through the air defenses and hitting one of Israel's military bases in the Negev. There's a difference that happened with this, because here's the situation in my assessment. We all knew that Israel can hit Iran. We all knew that Israel has hit Iran in the past with assassinations, etc. What we didn't know is the capacity of the Iranians to also penetrate Israeli air defenses, even when Israel has massive support from the United States and other countries. That's the big changes that happen now. And that, I think, is a strategic, not a defeat, but a bit of a setback for the Israelis, because it's moving the world back to the way it used to be, or more like the way it used to be before 1991, when there were other armies in the region that could take on Israel, at least put up a big fight and pose a threat to Israel, which all ended with the defeat of Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 1991. Since then, the Israelis have only been talking about a threat as an asymmetric threat, terrorism, or a potential nuclear threat. Now we're back into a different world again. And this world existed, but it hadn't been verified. Now it's verified.
We look at it today, and you see, countries like Jordan really destabilized by the ongoing war in Gaza. Destabilized because of its overwhelmingly Palestinian population, destabilized because of its seeming support in standing up, helping Israel when it was under assault by Iran. All of these things, they're playing out in different countries across the region. The street is boiling as they look on at what's happening in Gaza. And there is a real risk that these governments are in a very precarious position.
Absolutely. And I think that is one added reason as to why, from a U.S. national interest perspective, Biden should have pushed for a ceasefire very early on, certainly should not have stood in the way of it, as he has, by not only vetoing 3 resolutions at the UN Security Council, but also when he allowed the 4th one to pass, he immediately turned around and undermined it by claiming erroneously that it is not binding. The effects of this war continuing and not having a ceasefire is one, exactly what you said. You have several regimes in the region that risk falling, and they're not going to be falling and then be replaced by some sort of democratic alternative. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about transition to democracy. We're talking about transition to chaos. Secondly, the human suffering, which is, of course, absolutely devastating. Thirdly, the standing of the United States internationally, seeing the U.S. so isolated in the world. And remember, Biden said that this was going to be one of the big things that he was going to fix. He was going to restore America's global standing following the years in which Trump led a campaign that really was damaging to the U.S. And I would say that for the first 2 years, Biden actually was quite successful in doing so. He had some help with Putin, who emerged as a clear bad guy with his illegal invasion of Ukraine. But all of that has now been wiped out because of this consistent support for Israel's massacres, standing in the way of a ceasefire, rejecting a Palestinian state, as happened yesterday in the Security Council as well. Fourthly, you have the risk of escalation with Hezbollah, with Iraqi militias, with the Houthis, which then can drag the United States into yet another war in the Middle East. The strategic reasons to get to a ceasefire are so compelling. Set aside whether Biden is empathetic with the Israelis or with the Palestinians. Just set that aside for a second. The strategic reasons for the U.S., based on its own interests, to go for a ceasefire earlier on, in my view, has been so compelling. It is really perplexing as to why Biden has not only resisted it, but flat out rejected it for so long.
Well, we've seen mixed signals the whole way. I mean, Biden mentioned that he was going to support a Palestinian state. Then when it came to a vote, as you just noted, at the UN, the U.S., it's not that they just backed away, but I think you pointed out they were going around trying to cover their tracks so they might be able to, withhold their vote, to abstain on that.
Yeah, no, it's really sad to see, to be frank. I mean, with all of the influence and leadership the U.S. should have, it did not manage to get Ecuador. It did not manage to get South Korea, Japan. Countries are very allied with the United States, of course, close allies, to vote against this and by that enable the United States not to use its veto. Instead, the only country that kind of went along was the UK and Switzerland, who abstained, but then the United States had to put in a veto in order to stop this resolution. And by the way, this is a symbolic resolution. This is not a resolution that establishes a Palestinian state. It recognizes a Palestinian state as a member of the UN. The idea that all of the negotiations had to be fixed before this symbolic step could be taken, I think is highly unconvincing and frankly lends support to the analysis and the narrative that the United States, at least for the last 20 years, simply has not been serious about actually achieving a Palestinian state, but has been playing along with varying degrees of obstruction from the Israeli government, particularly, of course, when Netanyahu has been in power, who flat out has now admitted clearly for everyone to hear. He is praising himself as the person who has stood and prevented a Palestinian state from being created.
What he has proved, and I think, even among all those demonstrators that have come out to oppose changes to the Constitution in Israel, they voted for him too. And part of that is based on not only his claims, but his apparent ability to control U.S. policy.
Well, that's based on what he says himself. He's been caught on camera saying that no other politician in Israel has the capacity of influencing, manipulating U.S. politics. And without a doubt, I can tell you that there are members of Congress who are quite fearful of having someone like Netanyahu campaigning against them or essentially making statements that would be negative for them in an election season. So in some ways, he has been convincing to the Israeli public when he says this, because he is the longest standing Israeli prime minister. He did grow up or spend a significant amount of time in the United States. He does know the United States probably better, at least culturally, than the vast majority of other Israeli politicians. Now, whether he's reading or misreading the political landscape is a different story. It seems like both he and Biden are increasingly misreading the political landscape and the orientations and the viewpoints that are espoused by younger Americans in particular.
What people, I think on all sides at this point want is they want that ceasefire, and it just is not recognized that the outcome is almost already decided.
In what sense? That the outcome that the Palestinians...
Well, that Hamas is going to be debilitated. Israel is going to continue to pursue them. There is a chance, I think, to get the hostages, the Israelis that are being held inside Gaza, to exchange them for Palestinian prisoners. There's a lot of opposition to just another prisoner swap that leads us down the road to another hostage situation. But at the same time, the outcome, in my mind, is rather large.
I think you're quite right that some of the larger parameters of the outcome is largely set. I would add a couple of more. I think this has been a strategic defeat for Israel. Israel is more isolated than it has been since 1991. And though there is stronger support in certain political quarters for Israel in the West, particularly an interesting shift in Europe, outside of the West and in the global South, the global majority, it's been a devastating development for the Israelis. The other thing, though, is also that you're quite right. Hamas will be debilitated, but it is not going to be defeated. And this has also been quite clear from the outset. And this is one of those pieces of advice that the United States knew based on our own experience and should have been more forceful in conveying to the Israelis so they didn't repeat the same mistake the U.S. have committed during the global war on terror. But then there are
Let's divert for a second, and I want to ask you about, there were all of the people that said they were going to vote, not committed in this race. They've showed up. They have considerable numbers, and the assumption, I think, among many Democrats and the Biden administration has been, in the end, they will see that Donald Trump will be so much worse for the Palestinians, for the Muslim and Arab world, that they're going to turn around and stand with Biden at the last minute. Do you think that's still true?
I don't think that's true. I'm certainly not getting that impression. I think there is a segment of that group who last minute will shift and vote for Biden because of other fears that they have about Trump, not necessarily because they think that he will be better on this specific issue. But I think for many others, what has happened in the last 7 months has left one with the impression that if they're constantly going to be choosing between good and worse, bad and bad, worse options, they're always only going to have a variety of bad options to choose from. And that they want to send a much firmer signal that there has to be a much clearer differentiation between the Democrats and the Republicans on a whole set of issues, but also on this one. And I think for a lot of folks that are not necessarily follow this issue or may not have been as touched by it, for those who are touched by it, this is a very different dimension. I mean, we're talking about people who view this as a genocide. It is not the same as, well, I agree with him on 5 issues, but on these 4, I disagree. Genocide is a completely different category. And that's part of the reason I think that those who have voted uncommitted, very few of them will go back to the Biden administration in November. I also think that is the calculation of the Biden administration. Part of the reason why he is not shifting towards a ceasefire is because he's fearing that he's already lost some of these people and he's not going to be able to gain them back. I think there's some truth in that, but I think he's missing another point. If this conflict is allowed to continue, no ceasefire, then we may also see further escalation that includes the United States in a war in the region. If that happened, there's a third group of voters, those who have not made up their mind yet, who have not necessarily been very involved in this. He risks losing them, and they're probably the biggest chunk of the voter base that he has right now. People who have not yet abandoned. But if he allows this to escalate further into a regional war that drags the U.S. into it months before a U.S. election, I think he will lose a very significant portion of those voters That's why I think even though he may not be able to get back some of the uncommitted, he still has a chance of making sure that he doesn't lose more of them.
Let's come full circle. And as we look at the crisis as it's played out, Iran's role in all of that, its role with Hezbollah, its role with the Houthis, all of its proxies around the Middle East, whether they're in Syria, Lebanon, no matter where they are, what does Iran really want? Does it want a seat at the table that it's been denied? What is it?
I think the Iranian endgame is to make sure that the domination of foreign powers in the Middle East comes to an end. It does not mean the complete exclusion of foreign powers, but that the region no longer, particularly the Persian Gulf, will no longer be under the domination militarily by the United States. In some ways, that is kind of taking care of itself, however, to be frank with you, because the American public is increasingly favoring bringing troops home. And even within the U.S. military, you definitely increasingly hear the view that presence in the Middle East is just taking resources away from what they think is a more important factor, which is to focus on China. But I think also we're in a situation in which the Iranian government has transformed as well. It is far more hardline than it was 7 years ago, 5 years ago. It is far more radical than it was 5-7 years ago. It is far more uncompromising than it was before. We've seen the radicalization of an already radical regime taking place in the last 5 to 7 years, which to a very large extent is also a result of the maximum pressure strategy of the Trump administration pulling out of the JCPOA, betraying an agreement that both sides actually had agreed upon and both sides were living up to. So that raises question marks as to whether it also means that some of the previous goals they had in the region, which was, for instance, a seat at the table, may have now also been further radicalized and may end up being absorbed into a larger geopolitical competition that is taking place now, which is between the United States and China. So there's a lot of moving parts. That means that what they may have wanted 10 years ago may have unfortunately become more radicalized and more difficult to be able to find some sort of a common ground.
You know, maybe it was just rhetoric, and there's a lot of it that comes from Tehran and as well as Tel Aviv and Washington for that matter. But, you know, the notion that if Iran is pushed hard enough, Iran could decide to change course and say, we're going to develop a nuclear weapon, you know, with this knowledge that we have gained on, enrichment, uranium enrichment, which kind of a troubling, specter for people in the Middle East. And it could easily trigger, an arms race there, a nuclear arms race. And I'm just wondering how seriously everybody should take that. Or was this, Iran's, they developed the technology, they bring it all the way to the brink of a bomb, and now suddenly they say, well, we've decided that whole pledge that we won't build a bomb is out the window.
I think that we do have to take this matter quite seriously, but there's also a very interesting development that has happened there that could also give us a bit of confidence and calm. First of all, I think it's been very clear from the outset, the Iranian game plan, which actually was set during the time of the Shah, it's nothing new, frankly, was to get to the point of being able to build a nuclear bomb, but then not build it unless the geopolitical situation in the region changed so negatively that the utility of a nuclear weapon suddenly would exist. Under normal circumstances, it doesn't exist for the Iranians. It's actually a strategic negative for them. Iran is one of the largest countries in the region, largest populations, and has a natural conventional superiority. If it builds a nuclear weapon and actually helps bring the region, nuclearize the region so that even smaller countries such as Bahrain, for instance, were to build one as well, then Iran will have actually really undermined its own superiority or conventional superiority in the region, because then suddenly Iran and Bahrain are both at parity, both can destroy each other. So this is a key factor that is geopolitical, that doesn't really matter which regime is in charge, that has caused the Iranians not to want to go all the way. If, however, there is a direct attack against Iran by a state such as Israel or the United States. Those are the scenarios in which I think could cause the calculation to be changed. And we saw a very ominous warning by the Iranians yesterday, prior to the Israeli attack, in which they said that if Iran's nuclear facilities are attacked, then Iran may reconsider its position on nuclear matters, which essentially was code word that they may move towards weaponization. At the same time, we also have to say this. Despite the fact that they have progressed their nuclear program, and they certainly have, and despite the fact that there's been these massive sanctions by the United States under Trump that Biden has kept in place, despite the fact that you had the assassination of Soleimani and at least two other moments in which the US and Iran almost went to war with each other, nevertheless, we did not see the Iranians actually move towards weaponization, based on the intelligence that the US has, IAEA has, and other countries. And that tells us also something, that these geopolitical resistance towards building a nuclear weapon, because of these negative implications that I mentioned earlier, is not something that Iran will overcome easily.
You know, how much, we know that the JCPOA has been, scrapped by the Trump administration, but very quickly, when there were unfounded news reports coming out of Israel that one of the nuclear facilities in Iran had been hit, there were not only denials coming from Iran, but suddenly the IAEA chimed in to say, no, not true. How much is the IAEA still able to monitor what's going on at those facilities?
So thankfully, despite the fact that the Iranians have rejected and set aside some of the restrictions of the JCPOA since the US has walked out of all of its obligations under the JCPOA, but nevertheless, they have not reduced inspections of the IAEA. They did for a short period of time. It's now been restored, and that's crucial because it means that the world has its eyes and ears inside of the program. That creates transparency, and that also helps deter or dispel psychological warfare, which appears to have been what the Israelis tried to do at that time. So the IAEA is still in the program, but the Iranians are enriching at much higher levels than before. They are amassing low enriched uranium and medium enriched uranium at much higher levels than before. And all of those things are very, very worrisome.
When we look at the situation, there's a lot that, as you've noted several times, there's a lot the U.S. could be doing to defuse the war in Gaza. There's certainly a lot that Israel could be doing, but what could Iran do?
Well, what's interesting is that from what the US or the Biden administration has wanted from the Iranians has been to use its influence to get the various militias, the Iraqi, Syrian militias, and the Houthis to stop attacking US troops, stop attacking ships. What we have seen is that the combination of the US negotiating quietly with Iran behind the scenes, as well as the kinetic action that the US took against these militias, the militias reluctantly agreed to a ceasefire with the United States. They even complained about it publicly, but they did so as a result of the Iranians weighing in and pressuring them. The one group that hasn't is the Houthis, but it just clarified what many of us had said from all along, which is that the Houthis are not an Iranian proxy. They're close to Iran. They are armed by Iran. They technology transfers, but they're a very, very independent group. They don't belong in the same category as Hezbollah, for instance. And as a result, the coordination between them is much weaker, and the leverage Iran has over them is also very, very different from the leverage that it has with Hezbollah, for instance.
You know, one of the fascinating things about the Middle East today, and it has been true for years, but there is this tripartite backdoor, back channel relationship between Iran, Israel, and the United States.
There is. It existed much firmer, of course, before. Back in the 1960s and 70s, the Iranians and the Israelis were actually allies. During the 1980s, they were officially enemies, but geopolitically, they still had a lot of common interests. And as a result, the Israelis helped the Iranians extensively with arms shipments, violating U.S. sanctions even to send the Iranians weapons in order for them not to lose the war against Saddam Hussein. Since the 1990s, however, the situation has changed, and it's a much more open geopolitical rivalry and tensions between them. But even in these moments, there is diplomacy taking place behind the scenes. It is not at all at the level that I think it should be. But there has been deconflicting channels. And thankfully, they have existed, because otherwise, previous episodes may very easily have led to a much, much worse outcome. And if just take a look at what's happened in the last couple of days, it's very clear. The Biden administration played a very important role tactically to make sure that the Iranian response was within certain confinements, and then put pressure on the Israelis not to respond. The Israelis didn't listen to that, but they nevertheless did a much smaller attack on Iran than what they probably would have liked to have done, which meant that the Biden administration pressure on Israel actually worked out, which then raises the question, if we have the leverage to be able to pressure Israel, why are we only using it for tactical purposes to avoid the worst case scenario, and not using it to change the trajectory of the situation by getting a ceasefire, which incidentally is necessary to get the hostages released, not just because that's the only time we've seen a release, but also because many hostages, according to the Israelis, have died in Israel's own attacks on Gaza. So the number of hostages that are left now is different, lower than it was a month ago, 2 months ago. The hostages are also dying from this war. So the longer it continues, the less hostages there will be to release and win the freedom for.
As we look at the balance here, Israel has used Hamas as a means of controlling Fatah, keeping the Palestinians divided, saying then that we don't have a partner to talk to. And a lot of people were surprised when they learned how the Netanyahu administration has exploited all of that to reach short-term deals that left the Palestinians in a situation where they couldn't press for full negotiations even.
And it goes back further than Netanyahu himself, because at the end of the day, Hamas was actually created partly through the help of Israel as an effort back in the 1980s to undermine the authority of Yasser Arafat, who had succeeded in bringing almost all Palestinian factions under his leadership, which the Israelis viewed as a threat. And ever since, there has been this relationship. And on the one hand, they're viewing each other as existential threats, lethal enemies. But there has also been utility from the Israeli perspective to have Hamas there, to undermine Fatah, in order to say that, well, there's no peace partner on the other side. And as a result, we can't move forward with a two-state solution, which, of course, we now know, and we should have known much earlier, Netanyahu was never serious about in the first place.
Well, yeah, that has been clear. I think that just about everybody that's been witness to successive Netanyahu governments, as we look at it all, where do you think we're going here? How much time do we have in terms of this conflict? Because you've got a lot of things that are still on the brink or being held over our heads, including that ground assault on Rafah.
We are nowhere near being out of the woods yet, I would say. We have been very lucky that over the course of these 7 months, this has not escalated into a full-scale war. We have, of course, also been tremendously unlucky seeing the tremendous human suffering in Gaza that is taking place, that is going to have deep, deep repercussions, not just for those individuals, but for the psyche of the Palestinians, for any willingness, the political cost, the emotional cost to be able to shift towards peace has been made all the more difficult, mindful of how and the number of Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza in the last 7 months. And again, I think it very much comes back to the United States. It's the only country that actually has the leverage to be able to press the Israelis for a ceasefire. And I think here the Biden administration needs to disentangle its strategy from that of the Israelis. The Israelis have coupled the demand for the release of the hostages to a ceasefire, which on the surface makes sense. It sounds natural. Well, we end the war and you release the hostages. But by now, I would say that there are at least two compelling factors that says that those two demands have to be decoupled. Exactly as the Security Council did, incidentally, in its resolution that it passed. It had both of those demands, but they were not contingent upon each other. And the reason why they weren't is because if you make them contingent upon each other, then as long as the hostages are not released, you have actually justified the manner in which Israel is conducting the war, the manner in which it is indiscriminately bombing and killing up to 200 people on a daily basis. And then it brings in the moral question. To release what is now probably somewhere between 50 and 100 hostages? Is it justified to kill 200, mostly civilians, on a daily basis? Perhaps in the beginning, that equation looked doable, but 7 months into it, 34,000 Palestinians killed later, there's no way to defend that morally. And then finally, going back to what I said earlier on, Netanyahu doesn't have an interest in solving and ending this war. He has an interest in prolonging the war. More and more people in Israel are accusing him of having abandoned the hostages, that hostage release was actually never a priority for him. If that is the case, and we have coupled the demand for a ceasefire to hostage release, and he's not interested in a ceasefire, he's not interested in a hostage release, then we've coupled ourselves to a strategy that has been meant to fail, which may explain why it has failed for 7 months.
Trita Parsi, I want to thank you for your expertise and your deep knowledge of Iran and the Middle East, all of the players that are active here. Really appreciate your perspective and joining us here on The Brief.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of The Brief Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this discussion with Iran expert Trita Parsi and welcome you to share some of our other editions that are available on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Give us a follow, a like, or subscribe. Again, thanks. I'm Jim Clancy, and you've been briefed.